Okay, so welcome everyone. I'm Cassandra Julin, I'm heading PR, and I will moderate today's webinar. Today we're going to talk about use climate investment to reach true net zero emissions. Our speakers today include Ariel Hayward from Patch, we have Marianne Kruger from Sublab and ETH Zurich, and we have Alexandra Palmqvist from Normative. Before we get started, a couple of housekeeping rules. This webinar is recorded. Use the Q&A section for questions to the panel later on. We also have our Normative colleague, Max, who will help to react to thoughts posted in the chat and help you with some supportive links. So you can also share this link once the webinar is published with your friends and colleagues, and we hope that you will enjoy today's discussions. Before we get started, a couple of things. So we are from Normative, and Normative provides truthful, accurate, and scientific carbon accounting to help businesses measure and reduce their carbon footprint. So if you'd like to know more about Normative or get in touch with one of our experts working with net zero paths, then reach out to us and book a demo. And Max can help post the link in the chat if you're interested in that. So our first speaker today is Alexandra Palmqvist. She has long experience from working with climate investment, and she's one of our experts here at Normative in this field. But before Alexandra takes on the stage, let's see if we can get our first poll up. So here we go. Is your company using climate investment? Yes, no, or I don't know. This is just, to warm up a little bit and see where you're at from your organization and businesses. I myself will answer. Right, so if we can see the results. Interesting. So 16% says yes, about 64% says no, and about 20% don't know. So Alexandra, are you surprised by this?
Hi. No, actually not. Climate investments are a very broad topic, and I think this session today will help companies understand what type of climate investments they should be using. And I think a lot of the hesitation has been to the fact that we know so little about this topic that we're afraid that we're going to do the wrong thing. So what we're going to talk about today is how do we actually make sure that we do the right thing with our climate investments.
That's a very good reflection. So without further ado, I leave the floor to you to talk to us a little bit more about just that.
Great. Thank you so much. Let me share my screen with you guys. Yeah, so as Cassandra introduced you to, this is the topic for today. How can we use climate investment to reach true net zero emissions? So I just wanted to start by setting the scene. It's 2022 now, and we are emitting about 55 gigatons of greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere every year. And in order for us to avoid disastrous climate change, we need to find a way to understand these emissions and find effective ways to mitigate them. As you can see, the emissions come from many different parts of our economy, and we need to find ways to reduce them in every single step so that we can slide on this curve down into a more climate-friendly way of living. However hard we try, we cannot actually get to net zero. There are still going to be some emissions, and we need to find a way to balance these emissions, the ones that we cannot really avoid, with efforts that actually remove CO2 from the atmosphere, as you can see here towards the end on the carbon sinks and removal. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about net zero. What is net zero? Net zero is when anthropogenic emissions of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere are balanced by anthropogenic removals over a specific time period. This we need to do in order to stop global warming and to limit global warming to only 1.5 degrees. the world needs to halve the CO2 emissions by around 2030 and to reach net zero emissions in total by the middle of the century. So this is about the journey that we all need to be on this net zero journey. And as you can see from the graph, the major change that needs to happen are the emission reductions. But as I mentioned, it's very hard to get to absolute zero. And therefore, we also need to find ways to start enhancing the natural carbon sinks and actually remove CO2 from the atmosphere. But how does all of this relate to what businesses can and should do? So as you've started to see, and as maybe some of you have already done yourselves, businesses are setting targets for net zero, and most of them are setting them for the year 2030. So what would this actually mean for them? If you as a company have a commitment to net zero, you will need to find a way to remove the emissions that you cannot avoid releasing. Well, how can that be done? When we look at compensating the emissions on the net zero journey, there are two different stages in which we need to think about this. First, in the transition to net zero, and also at net zero once we're actually there. When we look about how to do this in the transition, it's according to the science-based targets, companies can opt in to compensate emissions in their transition journey, whereas once we are at net zero, greenhouse gas emissions must be compensated for with an equivalent amount of carbon dioxide removal. So great, that's it for the webinar. We can all go home. Let's call it back in 2029. No, wait, that's not really how it's going to happen, right? We need to find a way to get there, because otherwise we're all going to stand there in 7 years' time wondering, how am I going to get these removals done? So we need to find ways to scale this market, because currently we have a few ways of removing carbon dioxide, but they're not that many. So we need to make a collective journey to actually find a way to scale these removals, to make sure that the supply meets the demand by the year that we have set out to be net zero. And I would like to spend some time now looking at the different types of projects that can be used for carbon offsetting and what the difference between them actually is. So I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about the most conventional type of offsetting, which are called avoided emissions. Avoided emissions are arguably that we are implementing projects that reduce emissions that would otherwise not have occurred. So we are comparing an expected impact to a baseline or a non-intervention scenario. Examples of these projects include wind and geothermal and solar energy. So to explain in detail, what could a project like this be? Let's say we have a wind energy project in India. So we look at the emissions that are currently producing energy in India, and we look at the emission factor per kilowatt hour, and then we compare that to our new project. And this difference can then be accounted for as carbon offsets. But first of all, this doesn't actually mean that India will turn off the coal power plant that was currently supplying energy to the grid, as they are, like many other countries, still energy poor. And second, it can be very hard to ensure that these investments wouldn't have happened anyway. That's something I'm going to come back to a little bit later. The second type of projects that we can use for carbon offsetting are nature-based solutions, which are when we use trees and other types of vegetation that naturally bind CO2. So we can either plant more of them or protect areas that are vulnerable to deforestation, and in doing so, establish and maintain carbon sinks. This can be considered either avoided emissions, if we are avoiding an area from being deforested, or as a carbon capture, if we're actually increasing the uptake of CO2 from the atmosphere. There are different types of projects that can be reforestation, afforestation, or some type of forest management. But here it's crucial to consider, first of all, the risk of re-release. So how long will these carbon sinks actually be preserved? How long will the trees stay where they are, and how before they die or before something else happens to them? And it's also crucial to consider the leakage. So how do we know that the people who were going to cut these trees down don't just go somewhere else and continue cutting down trees? Then finally, we can talk about permanent removals. And I know Marian has a lot to say about these different techniques, so I'll keep this short and brief. But basically, we're talking about emerging technologies that can pull CO2 out of the atmosphere and store it permanently, where the expected storage can be up to about 1,000 years. These are generally very high-tech solutions to stabilize carbon and find long-term storage, sometimes even underground, so that the CO2 is effectively kept out of the atmosphere. A quick recap and overview of these. What is the actual difference? Well, when we offset by using avoided emissions, what we see is that no additional greenhouse gases would be reaching the atmosphere because of this organization or my investment. So my emissions happen, but someone else's emissions won't be happening. Whereas when we look at climate investments in permanent removals, which is what we need to get towards net zero, we look at greenhouse gas emissions that are caused by an organization and then subsequently removed from the atmosphere with a permanent removal, which means my emissions happen and the equivalent of emission leave the atmosphere. Well, from here, how do we assess these projects so we know what is reliable? What is actually a good project? Well, there are a bunch of factors that we want to ensure. First of all, we want to look at the additionality, which means that this removal would not have happened without this payment or this contribution, because if it were to happen anyway, why should I pay for it? This can be a consideration, especially when we talk about energy projects where we are actually producing energy, which will give a certain return on investment on the project, even to start with. The second factor to consider is, of course, the permanence. For how long will the carbon stay out of the atmosphere? And that can be an issue specifically, as we mentioned, with these nature-based solutions. We also want to look at that there is no double counting, which means that we use certificates to ensure that the credits are only being sold once. There is a risk with certain renewable energy projects or forestry projects where a country could want to claim these benefits to reach its climate targets. So we need to consider both what is going on a national level and on an organizational level in the private sector. Finally, we also, as I mentioned, want to ensure that there is no leakage. So in a forest project, for example, we want to make sure that loggers or people who need to deforest this area for economic incentives are not just going to another area. And in other types of projects, we need to consider that if we use a large amount of energy, for example, to capture carbon, this shouldn't mean that we then end up consuming more energy from fossil fuels elsewhere because there is a limited amount of energy available. So at Normative, when we talk about carbon removal, we want to make sure that we first reduce emissions and then remove them. So that the added benefit of this is, of course, that this is the most cost-efficient way if you can remove your emissions first. And only then we look at permanent carbon removal, which can be used to reach net zero. That means at Normative, we are not supporting any forestry or renewable energy projects, which is what we refer to here as conventional offsets. At Normative, we also help you handpick the right type of projects. So we can help you choose a specific project among available ones, or use a portfolio approach where a number of projects can be bundled onto a set price, and you can choose from that variety. Great. I think that was my very brief summary of climate investments at Normative. I'll pass it back to you, Cassandra.
Thank you, Alexandra. It's obviously a very complex subject, and it's not easy to do the right thing. And there are a lot of organizations trying and a lot of methods out there that wouldn't necessarily meet these 4 criteria that you talked about. But you normally give this great quote to me that I just love to paraphrase. But when you say that, it's all about, for those trying to do the right thing to kind of turn on the light and kind of show them the dotted line on the kind of path to go. Do you want to elaborate a little bit on that one and how kind of your approach to customers that are interested in this?
Yeah, of course. So what we see are a lot of companies who really want to do their best. I've been working in this field for a couple of years now, and I've still never met a company that said, hey, I just want to keep doing what I'm doing, but can I pay someone else to take care of the problem? I still haven't seen that. What I see are people who started saying, I want to do something extra. I want to go the extra mile. How can I do more? And that's the first couple of companies that came into carbon investments in the first place. But we are talking about businesses here, and like not everyone has a degree in environmental science and has a background in environmental project management. So it's incredibly hard to then assess what should I choose from this plethora of projects. A lot of people choose to go to the gold standard, which is one of the more well-known verifications for carbon removals. But on their platform, you have thousands of projects to choose from. So even when you have the best intentions, it can be really hard to make sure that the projects meet all of these criteria. And what we want to do at Normative is, as Cassandra said, to be the one turning on the light in this dark room where you're just trying to find your way, right? And say, hey, look at everything that we've learned so far. Look, we have learned so much about these projects. We have invested so much in renewable energy and protected so much forest. And that was a good start, but we need to take those lessons learned and go to the next level, which is carbon removals. How can we take the carbon out of the atmosphere? And I really think the time is ready for that.
That's a very good section. Thank you, Alex. So let's do another poll. Here we go. To follow up on this. So how many % of your company's total carbon footprint is currently offsetted? And if you don't offset, or if you don't know, just click the don't know. This is just a little bit out of curiosity to see where we stand from those working with this. All right. Should we see the results? And Alexandra, when we talk about the net zero journey, does this as well kind of reflect that you first actually need to reduce your emissions and kind of do what you can in that field, and then look at the offsets? Like, offsets is not really the one-way solution.
Offset is definitely not the one-way solution. And what we can see from companies is that the first time they measure their carbon footprint, it's really an exploration in where do they actually come from. So was it actually all the business travel that we were always talking about, that we shouldn't fly so much? Or were actually most of our emissions coming from somewhere else? So that we when we measure emissions, we see where they come from, and then we can figure out what to do about them. And sometimes we find that oh, great, thank you. Sometimes we find that when we do that, there are actually really easy ways of reducing your emissions. So a company I worked with a couple of years ago, they realized that they could drop their emissions by 60% by reducing their business travel. And that meant not only did they not have to stress about traveling to meetings, they also saved a lot of money from transitioning into digital meetings. And that money they could then use to invest in strategic client investments. So it was a win-win-win in all levels. But on that note, I mean, it can be costly to do these climate investments. So we need to be sure that we do them, strategically. We might not be able financially to offset our entire footprint if we are a large company, and then we might want to consider: can we start with offsetting or making climate investment that correspond to some of our emissions, for example, the direct and indirect emissions from energy use, or should we use a share of our total emissions and then try to increase that over time? So those are the types of questions that I help companies answer in my role as a climate strategy advisor at Normative.
Great. I'd love to dig into this, but before doing that, I think we have some other interesting people bringing a perspective on this as well on the panel. So we have Ariel Hayward, who is Sustainability Business Development Lead at Patch, and she's working directly with a lot of these projects on climate investment. We have Marianne Kruger, who's Project Lead Decarbonization at SUSLab and ETH Zurich. So welcome our panel. Before starting, I think, Marianne, you have a quite interesting title and job role. Do you want to share a little bit more about what you're actually working with and what you do?
Yeah, sure. First of all, thanks for having me. So while we are at ETH Zurich, we don't do any primary research, don't have to publish anything, but we sort of try to bridge the gap between science and industry, especially those industries that have a hard time reducing their emissions, be it because they have process emissions, cement industry, waste energy industry, or because there simply is no other alternative to the conventional way of emitting, aviation or maritime shipping to a degree, for instance. And we try to help those companies and industry, as well as the Swiss and other governments, to find ways of decarbonizing those hard-to-abate industries and emissions. And at times, that is possible. At other times, it is not, as Alexander has also pointed out. And those are the often mentioned residual emissions that, if we want to reach net zero, we need to remove and compensate for. And that is also part of the work that we do. We work early stage with carbon removal projects in Europe, all types of projects, from nature-based solution to more technological solutions, and support them in actually delivering the carbon removals that we need as a society, as a world, to reach net zero.
And when you hear Alexandra talk about these criteria that Normative is working very closely with, does that kind of resonate with how you work as well?
Absolutely, yeah, definitely. So the first distinction that Alexandra made, I think, is the most important one, namely the one between avoidant emissions and removals. Also, when you look at offsetting the emissions that you still have, it's crucial that we get to a point where we only use carbon removals to offset emissions that we could not reduce in all scopes that companies have. And within those removals, there certainly are a wide variety of pathways that you can choose, and some fare differently on the various parameters that Alexandra mentioned as well, right? Because a permanent removal can mean different things depending on the pathway that you take. It also comes at different price points regarding which permanents, or depending on which permanents you would like to choose. But all in all, I certainly agree. All carbon removals that we support, that we also would like to advocate for, are permanent. They're verifiable. They create no leakage, and they ideally also have side benefits, if not at least not side risk.
Thank you for that clarification. And Ariel, bringing you into the discussion as well, you're obviously working hands-on with a lot of these projects removing carbon. Do you want to tell us a little bit more how Patch is working and kind of also reflecting on these 4 criteria and how you see that they fit into the kind of hands-on work that you are doing with carbon removal?
Yeah, absolutely. So Patch is a platform for carbon credits. So we allow our customers to purchase carbon credits through our platform and to embed our platform within their customer experiences. So whether that be a climate accounting platform that wants to list certain projects, or an e-commerce platform to estimate and then offset a transaction, we can help companies do that. So we work with a significant number of project developers. And one thing I'll say is we work with project developers kind of across the spectrum of avoided emissions and removals and permanent and short-lived or short and long-lived duration removals as well. And so I'll probably have a bit more of a voice to across the spectrum here as well. But I would say that 4 principles that Normative has set out are really kind of leading the industry. They are industry leading principles around how to think about removal and the asset of a carbon credit itself and what it should be used for, and how a company can really compensate for residual emissions. So that is really where Patch is focused as well, is finding project developers who are working on these innovative solutions at the cutting edge to carbon removal, and especially frontier carbon removal with permanent storage. And so we kind of work with project developers in that spectrum. We can talk about some of the projects that fit within that box. And we also work with kind of the space classically as well around avoided emissions and short-term, short-lived storage for removals. So the reason we do that is, I think there's a bit of a conversation here as well around why the focus on removals versus avoided emissions, and what does that actually mean? And I think that the one thing that I'll say is we need all of the actions that all of these projects are creating, right? Like we need all of the renewables projects, we need all of the gas capture projects, we need all of these projects to happen, because we just simply do not have time to pick and choose only specific solutions. The questions really come in around, we often talk about the concept of counterfactuals for project development. What would have happened without the infusion of cash here? Would this impact have taken place? There's also the concept of counterfactuals for businesses making these investments. So if you're putting these dollars into these projects, where are you not putting those dollars? And I think really what the conversation that is being had right now is, first, within the mitigation hierarchy, as we think about business action, a company must focus on reduction, right? Like that is the absolute first step. You have to reduce your own emissions. And then where do carbon removals and offsets come in after that? And so I think a lot of the questions that we're delving into are less around project validity and do we need the solutions, and more around how should companies account for and take an action and invest in these solutions. So all of that is a bit of a long-winded way to say that we need all of the solutions, and Normative's approach, which is really prioritizing the permanent carbon removals, is industry leading. And I think if you want a solution that prioritizes the types of credits that will continue to count for years to come, Normative's approach really does that, and their project portfolio really does that.
Thank you for that reflection. So we get a couple of questions coming in right now. So a reminder to use the Q&A function for the questions that you have for our panel. One thing that stands out is, isn't it better to do something than nothing at all? Even if the offs may not be best, it might be one of those cheap click the box when you book a flight and think that, okay, well, at least I did something. Alexandra, I think I'll start with directing this question to you.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good question, and I see the value in it. However, I have a background in effective altruism, so we know that our resources are limited. We need to ensure that we spend them in the best way possible. And even if I only spend $1 here or there on other types of offsets, if I'm spending them on things that don't have an impact, I might just not spend them at all. And in that sense, I'd rather see companies spending a small amount on projects that they are very sure are having the impacts that they want to, rather than spending them a little or a large amount on projects that don't have the intended impact. Now, whether that should be nature-based solutions, permanent removals, or avoided emissions, that can be argued in different ways, but you should never spend money or any other type of resource on something that doesn't have the intended impact. So I think, so it's necessary that we find ways also to scale the carbon removal projects. And I think that's another good way to, even if you can only invest a small share of your emissions compared to if you could spend more money on cheaper projects, you would still have a higher impact. And that's kind of what you want to aim for. Yeah. Did that answer the question?
Yeah, no, absolutely. There's also questions coming in relating to the cost. And obviously each project has a specific cost, and it would be impossible to discuss all of the different costs relating to this. But I think it's still quite interesting here. Like if one was to go for permanent removals in isolation, will that be enough to achieve net zero? Like, are there enough projects out there to focus on these more high quality removals? If literally every company went for this route? This is an open question, so feel free to jump on it.
I would love to hear Marianne respond to this, actually.
So, yeah. Short answer, no. It's definitely a demand-driven market. So we are short in supply, not only in the short term, but also in the medium term from what we are looking at now. That's precisely why we are working with the accelerator program for early stage startups.
I think we lost him there for a little bit. Do you want to jump on that? Oh, you're back. Great. Sorry, we lost you there for a little bit. Do you want to retake that one?
My bad. I don't know how much you heard. Pretty much, yes, it is. It is a demand-driven market. We need more supply. It's precisely why we're doing the work we're doing early stage, supporting project developers. I'm sure Ariel can also talk a lot about this when they're trying to source those credits, because they are very scarce, especially on the high-end, high permanent frontier carbon removal. You really would be scrambling, and if you approach a Climeworks or other high quality carbon removal providers right now, you would have trouble getting credits before 2025. But Ariel, very happy to hear your thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, I would echo what Marianne said. In terms of available supply today, it's certainly not where the demand is. And so it will take some time to scale, but I think that's really why the normative team is focusing on climate investment. Is a lot of the action that companies are taking today is committing to future purchases of tons that will eventually come from these projects. So the concept of vintage, similar to wine, is the year of impact, really, that you're going to be paying for. And so what we see a lot of is companies purchasing future vintages for these projects. Now, there's an inherent level of risk in that. These companies are early stage and they're coming down kind of the technological learning curve. So they're coming to a place where their price will be more stable, their volume will be more stable as well. And so that investment is truly what it is. You're investing in the future of these projects and you're helping incentivize these companies and provide them with the offtake agreements they need to be able to scale their businesses. And so in terms of supply today, no, there's not enough to meet the full demand today, but there will not be. I think coming back to what Alexandra was saying earlier around, we can't get to 2029 and then decide to take action. That simply will not work. And so the investment piece today is really critical. And we're seeing a lot of brands really create innovative narratives around that as well. So you see Stripe, you see Shopify, Microsoft, some of the biggest names within the space, really advocating for the investment in carbon removals. And so that's really, and the brand story there is less around net zero today and more around building the net zero economy of the future and investing in the innovation and climate innovation we all need. So it's absolutely, that investment today is critical to create the supply that we will need by 2030, by 2050.
And Ariel, can you give some examples of some of the more impactful climate investments and projects that you're working on, like some that you'd like to lift specifically?
Yeah, so I think it's really important to define how we're talking about impactful here. I think in this way, as we're thinking about frontier carbon removal and really permanent long duration carbon removal that we've been talking about, the impactful piece of it is investing in it today, right? And so you're going to be investing in some of these earlier stage technologies and project types. So I'll talk a little bit about the project types that fall into this bucket. I know Alexandra mentioned them earlier during the presentation, but these are going to be projects like mineralization projects, enhanced weathering projects, direct air capture, and some of these like biochar and bio oil. So some of these biomass conversion and storage projects. So these are going to be, if you haven't heard of these project types already, they're continuing to gain a ton of traction in the space. And that's really, I think, probably where Marian spends a lot of his time as well, is thinking about these types of projects. And so the reason that I would bucket those in, climate investment has such a massive potential to impact those businesses is really where they are in the technological learning curve, but also their potential for really permanent long duration storage. One, I'll drop a link in the chat, but if you haven't read the Oxford Principles for Net Zero Aligned Offsetting, I think that's a really good place to start. It's a nice primer on how to think about credits and really everything. They have a taxonomy of credits in the kind of type 5, which they see as carbon removals with long-lived storage. That's really the types of projects we're talking about here. And I think those are the projects where investment today is going to have the greatest impact on them and call it the next 5 to 10 years. So I'll drop that link in the chat here shortly.
Great. We have a question in the chat. Just Alexandra, if you can remind us about the 4 principles again, we're talking about it, but just run them through again. And then another question for Alexandra. Is it even possible to reach net zero without using climate investment? Can you get there without this path?
Yes. So for the 4 principles, we did post them in the chat as well, but briefly. So we're looking at additionality, that this impact is wouldn't have happened without this support or this investment. We look at the permanence, for how long the carbon is being kept out of the atmosphere. We look at the no double counting, so that each carbon credit is only counted for once. And the no leakage, that we don't have a transferal of emissions from one place to another. And the second question,
the net zero road, can we get there without using climate investment?
I mean, I would love to see a company do that. That would be fabulous. But I think I haven't seen it so far, and I have a hard time imagining that. From the graph that I showed, I think the emissions that are remaining are mainly in the food and agriculture sector, where we're all going to need to eat, right? We can find carbon neutral ways of producing energy and doing a lot of other things, but there are still always going to be some residual emissions. So having removals allows us to have these emissions without having disastrous climate change. And I think, keeping in mind, sure, these are risky investments, but I think having 3 degrees climate change is a much worse risk to take.
Yeah, that's a great response. Marion, a question for you. If we're trend spotting a little bit, looking ahead, what kind of developments and projects would we expect to see in the future in this field? Like, where is the kind of research going right now?
Yeah, so I would say if we stick to the more permanent solutions and maybe sort of disregard the more nature-based removal pathways for now, I think what we are seeing is a broadening of the pathways. So Ariel mentioned a few. I know they might seem a bit cryptic for people that are not in the removal space, but direct air capture is one, more or less like a big vacuum cleaner that takes up air on the one side that has CO2, then has a chemical reaction in there, and then out of that vacuum cleaner comes CO2-free air. Those are already existing in operation, but they are quite energy intensive. So what we are now seeing, and what we will continue to see, is more and more shots on goal with different chemical reactions taking place with different setups, some more focused on scalability, others more focused on energy, reducing energy intensity. So I think we'll see a lot of shots on goal on that. There certainly is a lot of activity in the ocean space. So considering that, we as a society and as a world also run into land competition with regards to building up renewable power everywhere, or feeding ourselves with hopefully more veggie food than anything else. The ocean is a great place where we could place a lot of the CDR activities that we would need, for instance, through more nature-based pathways, but also through electrochemical pathways of taking CO2 out of the ocean and then storing it permanently. So I think there we will certainly see a lot more. And the third thing, if I can say, we've now talked a lot about the various pathways. If I look at the market, we will see a drastic rise. And I think, Alexander, you probably attest to this, in the demand for carbon removals, because a lot of the companies that have embarked on their net zero path have maybe now proclaimed the target of net zero at some point or another, now need to make sure that they actually reach it, right? They now need to follow that dotted line, Alexander, that you are helping companies show, and that often includes trying to figure out where those removals come from. And sooner than later, teams will come to you and come to you, Ariel, to figure out where they can get the removals from. So I see even in the short term, and especially in the midterm, a drastic increase in demand for these high quality, long permanence removal solutions. And that's only great for the space, but at the same time, and this is to close, makes it even more important that companies that can afford to do so and really want to do impactful climate investing procure, pre-sell, or invest in these early stage companies right now, because those are the ones that we will rely on to supply us with the removals that we will need in the future.
That's great insight. So it's all about being, one step ahead in your planning for your net zero journey. Alexandra, you work a lot with, meeting businesses and companies directly. What would you say are their kind of main concerns and challenges when it comes to this question? What kind of questions do you meet in your role?
I think the main concern right now on the consumer end is actually the price. And I know Ariel and Marianne get the similar questions. Yeah, but this is really expensive. Can't I just buy the cheaper ones? And I mean, sure you can, but you're not going to get the same outcome. It's challenging to explain that sometimes when, a ton of carbon is the kind of currency that we use to understand these projects, but what you're buying is actually not going to be the same. It's like saying, I want the carbon neutral way of traveling, and you're sure you can buy a skateboard, but you can also buy a Tesla. You just get a very different outcome. So what we are trying to help companies do is find a price point that they can cope with in the short term, while we see the market stabilize as well, because prices are kind of volatile on offsets in general. And we don't really know what the price will continue to be for the more high-tech solutions. So we try to help companies find a way to, spend enough money to get a good impact, but not having to, spend all of their revenue on offsetting their carbon footprint.
And is there any risk? Would you say there is any risk from a business perspective to not do anything, to just sit tight and wait for these projects to kind of develop and be more affordable and available? Or do you think one step ahead and planning is the way to go forward? And especially, I would say, if you're the big lighthouse leader within the field, of course, you should be one step ahead. But I'm also thinking about the businesses that may not be experts on climate, that may not, have 10 climate experts sitting, supporting them in this field in-house. What about them?
I had a really interesting conversation last week with one of our partners who said that your greenhouse gas emissions, that's going to be the company's biggest liability. And when I started working in this field, like some 13 years ago, that was like unheard of. But emissions are really becoming something that everyone is taking into consideration. And we also talk to a lot of investment firms, and they ask me, what should we look for when we invest in companies? How do I make sure that I don't invest in a company that's not going to be here in 10 years? And then when we look at our emission profile, that is for sure one part of it. Like, you don't want to invest in companies that are dependent on a fossil fuel economy. So that's going to be one part in how do we make sure that the companies that we have today can be sustainable and continue their operations into the future. And in that sense, the finding a sustainable way for carbon offsets and carbon removals over time is going to be a way to ensure that we stay within this space, that we stay within the planetary boundaries. So I think it's crucial to start thinking about that early. I'm also working on assessing the carbon footprint of a company that hasn't even launched yet. And I think those are going to be extremely attractive to investors in the future as well, because investors do not want to take more risks than necessary. And these are, to a large extent, avoidable risks.
Yeah. I had a question in the chat now. If there is some sort of matrix or formula that one can use, kind of dollar to the offset, if there's a way for them to kind of course, the price is the price, but also relating to impact and how much of these 4 criteria you actually meet. Is that something that you're working with, or is it really an individual project-based analysis? Maybe Ariel, you working on a project, want to answer this from your perspective?
Yeah, so I'll talk a little bit to how the space is evolving around project analysis and evaluation. So historically, when we've thought about the voluntary carbon markets, we've thought about certifiers. So we've thought about Verra and Gold Standard, CAR, American Carbon Registry. Those are still incredibly important and basically provide a binary measure of, is this a credit or is this not a credit? And they will issue a certain number of credits. There are new certifiers coming into the space, writing protocols for especially some of these new innovative techniques. those are really exciting movement within the certification space as well. Beyond that, we're also seeing other entities come in and really evaluate the projects beyond the binary, is this a credit, is this not a credit, to say this is the rating of this project. One example is Patch announced recently in a partnership with B0 Carbon based in the UK, who will be rating projects based on their rubric of, this is how important additionality and permanence and risk of overcrediting, leakage, all of these different components that, if you're a real carbon markets nerd like I am, are really fun to get into. And so they're going through and rating projects on an individual level. So that's one example of a company working in the space to provide more granularity and a more nuanced view of the impact of each project. Another example is Carbon Plan. So they evaluate RFP responses, so request for proposal responses, and they actually maintain a CDR or CDR database that is updated based on RFP responses. So those are a couple of resources, and we're seeing lots more emerge in the space as well that are trying to bring more, what is the true impact of this project, and how do I make sense of this project versus another project, or this type versus another type. Those entities are really exciting and coming into the fore quite quickly, and using all available data, all publicly available data, including satellite imagery and different sets from governments around emissions factors and things like that, to really help bring clarity to this conversation. So we're seeing a lot like that. In terms of dollar impact per ton, I haven't seen much in that way yet, but I wouldn't be surprised if someone's working on it. So it's much more around kind of quality ratings, and we're seeing a lot of movement there.
Mm. And kind of follow-up question, but not specifically for you. What about the legislation regulating carbon removals and how businesses are to operate within this field? Does someone want to comment on kind of what there is for a business to kind of be mindful of and be aware of in this space?
I can take the first crack, but I'm sure Alexandra has some thoughts here as well. I mean, it's really, first of all, it's really dependent on where in the world you're located. Each country, each region is going to have their own plan for managing kind of businesses' emissions. Some are operating within cap and trade systems, some are not. It's varied. Beyond that, though, something I think for businesses to keep in mind globally, there's a couple of groups that are working on really important work in this space. One is the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. They are coming out with kind of guidance for businesses on how to even think about the accounting of all of this, and different accounting and compliance bodies globally are taking note of that and participating in those councils. So how do you actually account for your climate liability? Another group to keep an eye on is the Integrity Council for Voluntary Carbon Markets. So this is used to be known as the Task Force for Scaling Voluntary Carbon Markets. They now have a specific group focused on what are the core principles of carbon crediting that businesses should think about. And those core principles are set to come out this year. So those are two to keep an eye on. The other realm to keep an eye on in this space is just what's going to happen to the Clean Development Mechanism and the new version of that coming out of COP26 this past year, and which projects from kind of the past CDM are going to be eligible going forward. There's lots of conversation about that. So that's much more, it's slightly different. It's very different from what we're talking about here, but there are definitely some movement to keep an eye on from a legislative and really more compliance perspective. We're talking about voluntary carbon markets and voluntary action, but that voluntary action is not just all altruistic. There's a lot of pressure across the board from different stakeholders.
Thank you for that. And do you want to add something to that, Alexandra?
I think Ariel covered it very well. Something that I noticed also when we do the carbon footprint assessment for companies is that their profiles look so completely different. And on that note, it becomes very hard to have complete overarching legal requirements for like removals or compensation. Even for accounting, even though I think that that's definitely one step closer. So we have the EU ETS system in Europe, where the biggest emitters are obliged to offset their emissions, which has been a great learning. But yeah, as Ariel said, this is the voluntary market, and it's driven a lot more by just market demands and yes, by public opinion, because that's in the end how companies appeal to consumers.
Yeah, and I'm just thinking to add one point to that. I mean, the climate investment and carbon removal market is voluntary, but businesses have higher and higher requirements on their kind of reporting and reduction plan. So that's something that we're definitely seeing the trend going into more legislation, not less, and kind of more more points to be aware of. Do you want to add something to that, Alexandra? Or
I mean, we are also transitioning into using the EU taxonomy and stricter limits for what needs to be included in a sustainability report. We're definitely going in that direction, but I think, especially since we're now talking to a not only Swedish crowd where normative is based, it's very hard to see this on an international level. I would say that maybe looking at national legislation could be relevant for sustainability reporting, but not really something overarching legal. Bigger than that. Just to see how long it took us to agree to the Paris Agreement says a lot about how hard it is for us to come to terms in how to handle climate change.
I fully agree. All right. So what would your kind of last words or kind of takeaways that you'd recommend, businesses, organizations, and companies that like to get involved in this field? What would your recommendation for them be? Let's start with you, Marianne.
Yeah, so I guess my first recommendation, and I think it's Swiss Re who posted this. It's do your best, remove the rest. So I think that should be the overall aim of any decarbonization efforts, right? Reduce however you can any further residuals you buy high quality permanent removals. And if we are aware of the supply constraints that we have right now, speaking now from sort of on behalf of all the early stage projects that I support on a daily basis, it would be great if you explicitly become sort of open and available as a buyer in this field, so that you show your peers that you are investing in early stage carbon removal, and that also the early stage projects can engage with you to do customer discovery, to learn where your needs are, how price sensitive you are, so that they can also, in a sense, cater to your needs. And in the end, the best you can do in this phase is, as I mentioned earlier, to procure and support these early stage startups in carbon removal with buying tons. And if it's only 10 tons, it's only 10 tons, but those 10 tons mean a whole lot to the carbon removal startups out there.
Great. And Ariel, what about you?
Yeah, I would say there's a lot of nuance in the space, and necessarily so, and it can be a bit paralyzing at times as a decision maker on how to make climate action. So I would say continue to have the conversations, continue to reach out to folks like Alexandra and Cassandra at Normative, reach out to us at Patch, Marianne as well. These are the conversations we all need to be having. And if you feel like it's confusing, it's because it is. And that's necessary, because we're all learning as we innovate. We're all trying to move as quickly as we can to create the kind of impact that we need. So it's okay that it's messy, and we're trying to all make sense of it. So just reach out and have the conversations so that we can all take action as quickly as possible, because the one thing that we just don't have is time.
I fully agree with that. And Alexandra, your kind of last giveaways to those that want to do this right.
Yeah, I think Marianne and Ariel captured it fantastically. I would just add, start now and start small. It's a journey. You might not be able to offset your 100% of your footprint in direct air capture today, but to start somewhere, take small steps, find a journey that works for you, and get help. We are here to help you. We're all very, very keen to answer your questions and discuss this. And how should I express this? Well, as humbly as possible, and reach out. Let's have these conversations.
And looking back at that poll, like the majority of the participants at this webinar, only 16% said yes, which means the remainder said I don't know or no, that they're working with climate investments or offsets, which means that there's probably a lot of questions around this and a lot of need for kind of support and guidance within this field. But thank you for joining this webinar to everyone who listened in, and thank you to the panel for sharing your insights and knowledge. The recording will be shared after the webinar, so you can share it with the colleagues and others that you think might be interested in this. We'd love to know what topics you'd like us to cover in the future. So if you will just stay one more minute, a little box will pop up and you can give us inspiration for our upcoming webinars. And if you'd like to know more about Normative and the work that we're doing on climate investment, then feel free to reach out to us and talk to one of our experts. So with that, I wish you all a nice rest of the day.